We continue now at the top of Daf Chesam and Beis Meseches Shevuos. This is Shevuos Daf 8b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was dealing with the Brisa, which talks about the Sor Hanasa Bifnim. This is the goat that is Nasa Bifnim on Yom HaKippurim. It's a carbon that's brought on Yom HaKippurim by the Kohen Gadol. And it said in the Mishnah that it's Mechaper on Tumas Mikdosh V'Kadashav in a very specific scenario. And the Brisa that the Gemara on the previous Amud was dealing with describes the scenario. We're talking specifically about a case where you have Yediyah Betchila, you have knowledge, the person was aware of the Tumah in the beginning, but then there was no Yediyah Basof. The person committed the sin, he forgot, there was a lapse of awareness, he forgot that there was Tumah, and so therefore he either entered the Beis HaMikdash Tameh or he ate Kodesh when he was Tameh, and then there was no Yediyah Basof. He never became aware of the fact that he committed this Aveira, and so then the Soyer Hanasa Bifnim, when the Kohen Gadol brings that Soyer on Yom HaKippurim, that protects him from any kind of punishment until he becomes aware of the fact that he committed that sin, and then when he becomes aware that he committed that sin, then he brings the carbon olav v'yored, which is a carbon chatas on a sliding scale. It's different depending on how wealthy the individual is. And in that brisa, the brisa had said that one might have thought that we're talking about a situation, the Sor Hanasa B'fnim gives an atonement in a situation, one might have thought it's talking about where there was Yediyah B'tchila and Yediyah Basof. Maybe that's the scenario that the Sor Hanasa B'fnim brings a kapara. And so the Gemara in the previous Amud asked, how could we even have had a thought that that is what the Sor Hanasa B'fnim is bringing a kapara for? That doesn't make any sense, because if you had Yediyah B'tchila and Yediyah Basof, you would have already brought a carbon. You would bring the carbon olav v'yored. You're aware of your sin. You bring the carbon olav v'yored, and then you get an atonement. What do you need the Sor Hanasa B'fnim for? And so the Gemara is in the middle of explaining what the Havamina is, because it could be a scenario could emerge where a person finds out right before sunset on Yom Kippur, never had a chance to bring the carbon olav v'yored, and so therefore nisli lei, so therefore the Sor Hanasa B'fnim will suspend any kind of punishment against the person for that time period until he actually brings the carbon olav v'yored. So there is a possibility you could have thought that's what it's for, and Kamash Malan, that's what the Brisa is teaching based on a drasha. The Brisa teaches no, the Sor Hanasa B'fnim does not provide anything for a situation where there was Yediyah B'tchila and Yediyah Basof. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the Master said, this also has a quote from the same Brisa, Minayin sheyesh ba, or li yesh ba Yediyah B'tchila ve'ein ba Yediyah Basof. From where do we know that if there was knowledge in the beginning, then there was a lapse of an awareness, and there was no knowledge at the end, the person had no idea that he committed the sin of Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav, shesoyer zeh tola. How do we know that this soyer, again, the Sor Hanasa B'fnim on Yom Kippur, how do we know it suspends, it protects the person from all kinds of punishment until he does become aware and brings the proper carbon? And the Gemara says, Minayin, what do you mean from where? What exactly is the Brisa asking in this line? And the Gemara explains this line in the Brisa. This is what the Brisa is asking. Once you're saying that the chatoim we are referring to are similar to a pesha is a sin that's committed on purpose. So we say again that the pshoim is something that you don't actually bring a carbon. So to here we're talking about something where you are not bringing a carbon. Again, that's why it's a situation where there was no Yediyah Basof, because the person isn't even aware, so he's not bringing a carbon. That's exactly, again, why the Sor Hanasa B'fnim is providing protection. But once you're saying that, but maybe we should say as follows. Ma Peshoim delav b'nei carbon liola. Maybe what it's protecting from is just like Peshoim, something done b'mezid, there is no carbon ever that's brought. Av chatoim delav b'nei carbon liola. Maybe actually what the Sor Hanasa B'fnim is giving a kapara for is sins in which a carbon will never be brought. Umay ninu, and what would the scenario be? Ein bo yediyah b'tchila v'yesh bo yediyah b'sof. That could be a scenario where the person didn't even know originally there was any tumah. In that case, you actually never bring a carbon. Then the person found out at the end that there was some situation of Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav. Maybe that's the scenario that Sor Hanasa B'fnim brings the kapara. Avol yesh bo yediyah b'tchila ve'ein bo yediyah b'sof. But maybe in the case where the Sor Hanasa B'fnim actually does protect, but maybe in that case where there's yediyah in the beginning and no yediyah at the end, kevon dechim misyad delay bar carbon, since eventually when the person will find out that he sinned, he will bring a carbon. Maybe we should say that in that scenario it should not suspend and it should not bring any protection. And if you're going to say, maybe you'll suggest, maybe you'll say that in that scenario where you're now assuming that maybe the Sor Hanasa B'fnim is giving protection and giving kapara, which is the case where there's no Yediyah in the beginning and there's Yediyah at the end, maybe you'll think Sor Hanasa B'chutz v'Yom HaKippurim mechaper. Maybe you'll think that over there, the Sor that's actually on the outside on Yom Kippur will be mechaper. Maybe one would think that we should reverse it And Rashi over here explains, Nepuch mepuch zeh yechaper al she'ein ba yediyah b'tchila v'yesh ba yediyah b'sof. This one will bring the kapara on a case where there's no yediyah in the beginning and there's yediyah at the end. Delo asi l'chlal carbon, that there's no carbon in that scenario at all because there was no yediyah b'tchila. Maybe that's what the sar hanasa b'fnim is for. V'hachitzon yisla, and maybe we should just reverse everything. The sar b'chutz, so the sar la'azazel, that's the one that will suspend. Al sheyesh ba yediyah b'tchila v'ein ba yediyah b'sof, in a situation where there was yediyah in the beginning and no yediyah at the end. Ulahachi itzrich l'chol chatasam, and maybe that's what the pasuk of l'chol chatasam is coming for. Amar Kra, the pasuk says l'chol chatasam. Again, the pasuk says l'chol chatasam, as the Gemara now explains, michlal devnei chatos. That implies that there is some kind of chatos that is going to be brought. And Rashi explains l'chol chatasam v'lo ksiv mi pisheim v'chatasam. It doesn't say from their pishoim and chatoim. Lomar achshavu bepesha she'eno bar karban v'yisla olav ad sheyavo l'chlal chatos, to say that there's the situation is bepesha where there is no carbon, and it's going to protect him until he does find out that there is that there was a sin and he has to bring a carbon chatos. In other words, that's what l'chol chatosim is teaching us. L'chol chatosim is teaching us that the sar hanasa bifnim is specifically for the scenario where there was yediyah batchila and there was no yediyah basof, so he wasn't aware of the sin to bring a carbon. But the idea is that when he does become aware, so then he will bring that carbon in the interim. This sar hanasa bifnim is going to provide that kapara. So essentially, what the Brisa was saying was one might not have realized exactly which scenario the sar hanasa bifnim is bringing the kapara. Maybe we would have reversed it and thought that was the scenario for the sar hanasa bachutz, etc. And that's what l'chol chatosim teaches us. L'chol chatosim teaches us again that the sar hanasa bifnim is specifically where there's yediyah b'tchila and there's no yediyah basof. And the Gemara continues and asks, v'nischaper kapara gemura. So the sar hanasa bifnim, which is being brought, and it's giving this protection in a situation where there was yediyah batchila, no yediyah basof. Why don't we just say that that's a kapara gemura, a full atonement, and maybe we should say the person never has to bring, even when he becomes aware, he doesn't have to bring the carbon olav yored. And the Gemara says, iksiv mechatasam kidako amrin. If it would have said from their sins, then actually that would be correct. As you're saying, that we would say mechatasam, it's a complete kapara from the sin, and we would say the sar hanasa b'fnim provides a complete kapara again for the case of yediyah betchila, no yediyah besof. Hashda dechsiv lichol chatasam, but now that it says lichol chatasam, what it means is lahanach da'asu lechlal chatas. It means situations which are going to come to a chatos, meaning eventually you will bring a chatos when you find out you did the sin, and now it's just providing that temporary protection. The Gemara now clarifies that now if the sar hanasa b'fnim isn't providing an atonement, lamatola, so what is this suspension over here? What protection is being afforded? Amar Rabbi Zera says lomar, it means to say she'im meis, that if the person would die, meis below avon, he'll die without any sin. Let's say the person dies and doesn't get a chance to bring the carbon olav yored, so this is going to protect them from that. Amar le Rava said to him, he said to Rabbi Zera, im meis, what are you talking about? If he dies, misam imarekas, he's actually cleansed by the death. The protection or the atonement will come through the death itself, and so you don't need the sar hanasa b'fnim for that. So Ela Amar Rava, rather Rava says, and this is what Rashi already said earlier, what it means, lahagin olav min hayisurin. What it means is, it's a protection from afflictions. This person doesn't realize that he committed the sin of tumas mikdash v'kadashav because there was yediyah betchila, no yediyah basof, and so now, until he does find out and bring the proper carbon, which is the carbon olav yored, he needs some kind of protection from yisurin, from afflictions. That's what the sar hanasa b'fnim, that's the protection that it provides. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, ein bo yediyah betchila v'yesh bo yediyah basof. If you have a situation where there's no yediyah in the beginning, no awareness of the tumah, now in that situation, there is no carbon olav yored at all, there's no carbon at all, so where do we get? He has a yesh yediyah basof, he finds out at the end that there was a sin of tumas mikdash v'kadashav, so there, the sar hanasa b'chutz v'yom ha'kippur mechaper. That's where the sar that's done outside, and Yom HaKippurim, they provide the kapara for that. Again, that's what the Gemara was saying above. Maybe one would have thought that it was reversed, but this is actually how it works. In the case of ein bo yediyah betchila v'yesh bo yediyah basof, it's the sar hanasa b'chutz and Yom HaKippurim that provide the kapara. And the Gemara says, Michli, let us see. Iskushe iskush lahadadi. They're really compared to one another, meaning that the the inner, the sar hanasa b'fnim and the sar hanasa b'chutz, they're compared to one another. And so the Gemara therefore continues and asks, v'nechaper pnimi, so why don't we say, for example, that the sar hanasa b'fnim should bring a kapara adidei on its particular scenario, which again is the scenario where there was a yediyah b'tchila, no yediyah basof, v'yad chitzon, and maybe it also provides a kapara for this situation, which is the sar hanasa b'chutz, the situation of no yediyah b'tchila and yesh yediyah basof. Let it be that it provides for both of them, if they're compared to one another, so maybe it provides kapara for both. And v'nafkamina, now the difference would be, why would we need now a double protection for the case of chitzon? In other words, in the case of ein ba yediyah b'tchila v'yesh ba yediyah basof, if the sar hanasa b'chutz is already providing the atonement, why would we say that the sar hanasa b'fnim is also providing atonement for the same case? The Gemara says no, it would make a difference. Lahecha delo avad chitzon. Let's say you have a situation where the person wasn't able to do the sar hachitzon, as Rashi explains. V'nafkamina lahecha delo avad chitzon im lo hayalem seirim b'chol hatzorach. Let's say they didn't have enough goats, so they weren't able to do the sar hanasa b'chutz at all. So you would have a kapara through the sar hanasa b'fnim. And the Gemara says that we don't say, because Amar Kra, the pasuk says achas. It says achas one. We'll see Rashi in a moment on this. And the idea is kapara achas mechaper v'yeno mechaper shtei kaparas. There's only going to be one kapara, not two kaparas. Sar hanasa b'fnim is not going to provide kapara in two scenarios. And the Gemara continues and asks along the same lines, v'nechaper chitzon adidei v'yamai David pnimi. Well, why don't we say the other way around, that the sar hanasa b'chutz, that provides atonement in its scenario? Again, its scenario is ein ba yediyah b'tchila v'yesh ba yediyah basof, and maybe it also provides an atonement for the pnimi, for the inner case. Again, that case of the sar hanasa b'fnim was the reverse situation where there's yediyah b'tchila and there's no yediyah basof. And what would be the difference over there? Nafkamina l'tuma di'ira bein zeh lozeh. Then we could say that there's a nafkamina. Let's say the tuma happens in between the two cases. In other words, you have the sar hanasa b'chutz and then you have the sar hanasa b'fnim. Something could happen in between. Maybe you do need that extra protection. The sar hanasa b'chutz will take care of something that happened after the sar hanasa b'fnim. The sar hanasa b'fnim was already brought, and then the same kind of tumah occurred, which normally the sar hanasa b'fnim provides protection for. So now you're going to do the sar hanasa b'chutz after the sar hanasa b'fnim, and it will take care of that. Maybe we should say that. And again, the Gemara says Amar Kra, the pasuk says achas b'shana, again once a year, and the idea is again it can only provide one atonement. Kapara zu lo tehei. This kapara is only going to be once. And Rashi explains Amar Kra achas. The pasuk says achas. Again, that was talking about the sar hanasa b'fnim. How we know that the sar hanasa b'fnim is not mechaper on both, because it says achas v'chiper Aaron al karnosav achas b'shana over mizbeach hapnimi ksiv. Again, it says v'chiper Aaron once a year. That's talking about the mizbeach hapnimi shemechaper all of midam hapar v'soyer. That there's a kapar from the dam of the par and the dam of the soyer. The par is la kohanim. The par is the kapar for the kohanim. The soyer lam, and the soyer is for the people. That's what we're talking about over here, is the soyer. V'hacha kra yiseiru. This is an extra pasuk. Because what do we need this pasuk for? Ila oroye loch shadam chatas hakipur mechaper olav. If it's just to tell us that the dam chatas of Yom Kippur is a kapara, behed yiksib ba'acharei mos. It already says that in acharei mos. V'yotzel mizbeach asher lifnei Hashem v'chiper olav. It says that. Ela l'drasha asa. Rather, it's for this drasha. V'kamar achas tein kana lekapara achas. It's saying achas. There's one kapara the sar hanasa b'fnim provides. It provides in one scenario of yesh yediyah b'tchila ve'ein yediyah basof, and not in the other scenario of ein yediyah b'tchila and yesh yediyah basof. And then the Gemara brought the pasuk for sar hanasa b'chutz as well. Amar Kra achas b'shana. The pasuk says achas b'shana. Trezim neksive achas b'shana. It says it twice, achas b'shana. It says v'chiper Aaron al karnos of achas b'shana midam chatas hakipurim achas b'shana yichaper. Again, it says it two times, achas b'shana. Bereisha the krasamach achas lev'chiper al karnosav. In the beginning of the pasuk, it says achas close to where it says v'chiper al karnosav. Rashi quoted that above. V'darshinan minei v'chiper achas shein kana lakapar achas. Again, saying there's only one atonement. Limei shein mechaper kapar acheres, that there's no other atonement. Uveseifa dekra, and then at the end of the pasuk, samach yichaper levashana. It has the word yichaper close to bashana. T'chsiv achas bashana yichaper lomar shein echad mikol karbonos hashana mechaper kapar zu ela zebelvad. It means to say that none of the karbonos give this kapara except for this. And again, so you learn out from both of these times when it says achas, you're learning out again that the sar hanasa b'fnim provides for its case, and the sar hanasa b'chutz provides for its case. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tes Amud Aleph.